Welcome to the Exploring the Core podcast. I'm your host, Greg Mullen. In the last episode, I shared conversations with two amazing educators who were taking two different approaches toward balancing conventional schooling and self-directed learning, which I described at the start of that episode as being two sides of the same coin. Well, today, I'd like to share conversations with two other amazing educators whose beliefs lean more heavily toward the self-directed learning side of that coin. And it's that word belief that I want to explore a bit first, because I think it's a really important word when it comes to education. You see, a belief at its core is a statement. It's an idea that is accepted as true. The statement could be a fact, like how a molecule is made of two or more atoms, which is how we know two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom create a molecule we call water. So that's one type of statement. But we can just as easily accept a statement like rock music is the best or bacon ice cream is the worst, which is where the idea of a belief becomes much more interesting. That's because the strength of a belief might be different from one person to the next and from one idea to another. But how do we know how strongly a person holds a particular belief? The strength of a belief lies in the decisions we're willing to make based on that belief statement. So now we have two pieces to this: a statement we accept as true and the decisions we make based on that statement. Well, in education, we might meet a person who says they believe in a particular pedagogy or specific teaching practice. This means that they might accept that a statement about the effectiveness of a pedagogy or practice is true, yet still be unwilling to make decisions that reflect that effectiveness, meaning they say they think it's a good teaching practice, but don't actually use that practice. In this case, it might be a belief, just not a very strong one. If instead this person not only accepts that a teaching practice is effective, and bases much of their daily teaching routine on it, the person clearly values it enough to create a learning environment based on it, and so clearly the person holds a much stronger belief in that teaching practice. But there's one more aspect about beliefs that we want to consider, and it's where we get into the most interesting part about beliefs, and that's exceptions and boundaries. Now, I'm purposefully going to avoid using examples that are so specific that it becomes difficult to see the transferability of this idea. The example I'll be using isn't terribly divisive. It's actually a natural phenomenon, and is a statement I think most people have not only heard, but generally accept is true. The statement is, what goes up must come down. Now, we know if we toss an object in the air, it'll come back down to the ground. And we see this happen in a lot of different ways. We throw a ball to a friend, knowing it won't fly off forever into the sky. We crack an egg, knowing it will drop into our frying pan. We'll even board an airplane, knowing that when it's flying 10,000 feet in the sky, it will return safely back to the ground. So whether we're deciding to play catch with a friend or fly on an airplane, we can be pretty confident in our belief that what goes up must come down. And this belief has been pretty much indisputable for the entirety of human history until we figured out how to travel beyond Earth's atmosphere, being able to propel objects like rockets, satellites, and even things like the Mars rover into outer space, never to return again, is an example of exceptions and boundaries to that belief statement. And that's the point I'd like to highlight here as I shift back to the topic of education, that even as beliefs are challenged with new ideas and new information, it isn't that the belief goes away. It just becomes a statement in which we not only agree with the statement itself, but also its exceptions and boundaries. And it's this idea in education that even when you've spent a lifetime making decisions around certain beliefs, there may be exceptions and boundaries that are introduced, which you might want to consider. Because this idea isn't about proving or disproving a statement wholesale as true or not true. It's about accepting that a statement can be true, including its exceptions and boundaries. So, with that in mind, I invite you now to think about the following statement that builds on an idea from the last episode, exploring our beliefs about what school and learning are. The statement is, school is optional, learning is natural. I like that because one, it's a fascinating coupling of school and learning as two separate things, but it also happens to be the title of a book by Ken Danford, who was nice enough to speak with me about his book and his thoughts on school and self-directed learning. Ken Danford is the co-founder of North Star, self-directed learning for teens in Sunderland, Massachusetts. North Star has been around since 1996, helping teenagers find ways to learn and excel outside of traditional middle school and high school. It was fun to chat with Ken about his book, School is Optional, Learning is Natural. He published this book just 2 years ago in 2019 and highlights his journey and insights from his 20-plus years leading North Star. I asked Ken about a few of my own takeaways from his book, one being about the data he had collected on those who had chosen to opt out of school and attend North Star.
It's like, to the extent that my book is funny, which it's not, but it's like the punchline is, what's the first thing they do when they leave North Star is 80% of them choose a schooling setting when they're done with us. Like, far from coaching kids to never go to school again, and I'm the Pied Piper of doom, I'm giving kids an out until they're ready for it. And then they all choose, not all, but 80% of them do choose to either return to junior high or high school or community college or 4-year university or a 2-year or formal training program or some official organized thing. And only 20% go off to either work for other people at ordinary jobs or entrepreneurial things or travel the world loose as nomads or whatever they do. At most 20% of my kids are falling into that zone. And 80% of the kids that I've coached to opt out of school are like, yeah, well, that was good for a while. Thanks, mister.
The impact Ken describes having is important because it speaks to the value of this statement that school is optional, learning is natural, especially in the way school might benefit some, but not others. Since Ken's been running North Star for more than 20 years now, he's had a lot of experience with parents of kids who want to opt out of school. And we talked about the kinds of families who find themselves reaching out to North Star.
I think any moment, I think kids who are thriving in school might consider opting out if they're bored. And I think the kids who are struggling and starting to fall off the track can also consider opting out. And, the concern that most parents have whose kids are in school, and again, I'm going to lump private schools that are traditional private schools and public schools together here. People have tried to get their kids into the best school situation they can manage for their family. And they want their kids to just do it and get the diploma and get the good grades and be able to apply for college and, be a functional 18-year-old kid. That's what everybody's trying to do. And we can assign everybody decent motives for that. And so falling off that track, parents' first normal response is, well, how do we help you get back on track? What can the school do? What can we change to make school bearable for you? What can we get? Different teacher, different class, different schedule, different school even, right? But the first response is always how to make this work, how to stay on the track, because we have mythologized leaving the track as ruining your life, as dropping out and becoming, a ditch digger who's, worthless. And we don't associate leaving school with, a head start on life. That's just not what we do in this culture. And so any normal, reasonable parent's first response to their kids saying they hate school is to try to help them figure out how to make school more bearable. And also then I think there's another fear that parents have of allowing their kids to quit. If the going gets rough, you quit. And, obviously I don't see it that way. It's a common objection. And so parents in their good intentions often want to make their kids just stick it out because you got to learn some grit, kid.
As I think about Ken's perspective on how opting out of school can benefit some, not all, it makes me think about how the value we place in different kinds of schools can have different purposes that benefit people who have different goals, but that we often don't realize how many different types of schools there are. So I asked Ken about the kind of impact a place like North Star can have for someone who's coming to realize that the traditional school path is just not working for them. It might actually be working against them in the long run.
Private schools are also traditional in their approaches, and they're just glorified. They're like public schooling, English, math, history, science, are 4 years to get good grades to go into college. And, most elite private schools, most religious, Catholic schools or whatever, charter schools are all, they're not private, they're public, but they're all of the same ilk, right? And so what you're talking about, I believe, are, there's some, project-based learning schools or fairly conventional schools, but are still outside of that realm, that are a little more creative. And then there's a whole little wing that I'm involved in that isn't homeschooling, but it's more like the democratic free schools and Sudbury schools, Summer Hills of the world, right? There's not that many of these schools. They're a tiny handful, and I'm friends with these people. We're in the same universe. But there were even in these schools that I'm talking about, the democratic free schools and Sudbury's, are even outside the realm of what we call Montessori or Waldorf or project-based schools, right?
Right.
And even then, then we're dealing with the same kinds of parents. But the parents who go to these places, for the most part, have a child who is unhappy and the parents can't live with it. And I mean, if you can live with public school, the big yellow bus comes and drives you away and it's free and you have your friends, the neighbors and sports and clubs, and you just go do it. That's the American way. That's like 80%, 90% of America. Oh, and then there's some percentage of kids who actually like the public schools or, really enjoy their private schools too. So, you get some percentage of kids who really like school, look forward to it, it's good. You get a bunch of people who just put up with it like they're supposed to. And then we get the people who are falling through the cracks and making a mess. Now, some of the people, while they hate it, are still doing it well. They still go every day. They're passing. They may even be getting A's and B's. They're the desperate poets of the world who are getting A's in school, and they're kind of, introverts or whatever. But, they're going through the motions. They're doing it, but they really hate it, right? And they make enough noise at home to force their parents to look for, like, how many more years of this do I have to go? I really want to be outdoors. I really want to make my art. School's not helping me. Do I really have to do this? And they say it more than once, and they force an issue, even while their brothers and sisters may still be doing school okay, right? Or even while their parents work in school. These kids are noisy enough about it, right? Or worse, they're harming themselves. They're anxious. They're depressed. They're losing it, or they just absolutely refuse to go to school. And say, you can't make me, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to get an F just to see what happens to me because this is so stupid.
Sure.
And so I think the first thing that you get that brings parents along is, you do get some proactive parents who from the beginning of age 4 or 5 are like happy with their little children and don't want to send them off to school. And they investigate homeschooling and they pursue it as far and as long as they can, as best they can, with little homeschooling co-ops and groups until they can't, or until the kids want to go to school for junior high or high school. That's pretty common too. But sustaining it through the high school years or getting people to consider an alternative who've been in school, I think mostly it has to start with some need of, this is really not working. And so, and then we want to make it less scary. Like, yeah, it's not working. I mean, don't worry, it's not supposed to work. It's no big deal that it's not working. Everybody lighten up over there. That's what we're trying to do. And then people have to be open to hearing that.
When I think of this idea of school not working for someone, and then I think about this statement, school is optional, learning is natural, it makes me think of a common issue people have about what happens if a person doesn't attend school. How will they learn? It also makes me think about what happens when a student goes from a conventional school structure to a more self-directed one. I think back to my own education in public schools, and I think about myself as a teenager in high school. If I were introduced this idea that school is optional, I just don't think I'd place much value in the statement. I can't imagine I would drop out of school because I think at that stage of my academic career, I wouldn't know the first thing about how I would want to spend my time or know what or how I wanted to learn because I'd never been expected to think about learning separate from school. So I asked Ken about the families who end up placing value in this statement that school is optional, learning is natural, and how the process of unschooling a child fits into this process of opting out of school.
I think it's so common, right? And the key things, I would use the word, you said, if you unschool a kid, and I don't think it's a transitive verb that you do to somebody else. Unschooling is something the kid does, or maybe the family does together. It's not something you do to somebody else. You don't unschool somebody. You're offering them a chance to unschool. And the kid says, yes, I'd like to be an unschooler, right? And then you say, well, what does that mean to you? And it means the elimination of arbitrary assignments for the most part, right? And, come up with the things you want to do authentically. And the kids say, I don't know where to start, right? I just did a consultation with a kid who is being allowed to unschool, doesn't know what she really wants to do. And when she gets bored, she gets mad at her mom for being a lousy mother. It's fine to not know what you want to do, and it's fine to be bored, and it's fine to be frustrated, but don't get mad at your mom because she's giving you freedom and you don't know what to do with it. Ask for suggestions and take them seriously. But, it's two sides. Is there some responsibility here is what I'm getting at, right? There can be safety measures or limits of, you can't be in your room with the door shut all day. You have to get out of the house at least once a day. You have to talk to some humans every day. You may or may not be read a book every week or have an instrument in your life or have some creative art in your life or nature in your life. I don't know. Families have different, priorities. To say, I'm all good with getting you out of the school, but for me to sleep at night, can we have a few things that are agreements so that, while I ignore you, I don't have to worry. And, the kids should basically more or less agree. Now I see kids who won't agree because they feel that's just the first step of a slippery slope to being controlled by their parents. They'd rather just go back to school then if they're going to get controlled by their parents. But for the most part, you can come, I encourage people to come to some mutual agreement of what feels safe and reasonable, and that the parents kind of can't be arbitrary. The parents have to be able to explain in real words what it is they're afraid of, what it is they need and why they need it. And even if it's a little bit irrational, the kid gets to hear it and maybe once in a while indulge their parents' irrationality. And at the same token, the kid doesn't get to wish for everything and anything and just, be a spoiled brat. Whose parents are not supposed to fund every last dream they have or leave them loose to do whatever. There's a middle ground, that's pretty wide. I mean, most people can fall into this pretty naturally of well, how do you work out a relationship with in a family situation with a 14 or 12 or whatever old kid who's now being given the freedom to not go to school?
I did know what Ken was getting at, and it's important as we continue exploring this idea of beliefs, the value we place in them, and the decisions we make because of them, that we think about the kinds of exceptions and boundaries that might apply to different families in different ways. It's a difficult conversation for families who have only known the conventional schooling option, and that shifting just a bit of value towards this statement that school is optional, learning is natural, might only result in the conversation taking place at all, and that bigger decisions like opting out of school will reflect a higher value and a stronger belief. And this might require that their conversation approach issues of trust, authority, and responsibility for how time is spent, how expectations might need to shift, which Ken brings up in our conversation as we got into what it means to learn how to learn, and to give students the freedom to explore interests they might not have ever realized they even had in the first place.
Before you even start working on the relationship, for me, it's the part of, why I wrote the book, but it's the perspective that everything doesn't matter as much as let's focus on the right things, right? And I'm basically, in a nutshell, saying schooling, academic learning is irrelevant in the long term. I mean, it's interesting. Everybody should want to learn and read and count and The world's a curious place, and we need scientists, and we need people who speak multiple languages. And I like having musicians and artists around to entertain me. We need people to be good at things, and I want people to be good at things. But what we learn in school and from school, the narrow set of skills that we work on incessantly in school, are pretty trivial and pretty irrelevant. And so let's focus not on keeping up with grade levels and focus on what's going to happen to you if you don't write book reports this year. And getting, it is letting go of all that fear and all that external stuff to be able to start with the premise that we need to have some things that you care about, that you want to know. We need to get some curiosity going. We need to have some reason to get up in the morning, some things to do, people to see, places to go. What's going to float your boat? And can we do that in a way that I can say yes as a parent and not feel rotten, and that I'm not, being dangerous or bad? So say yes as much as possible, but it's much easier to do the unschooling thing if you've absorbed the confidence that when your kid's 16, 17, 18, no matter what they've done when they're 12 to 17, if they haven't harmed themselves irrevocably, physically or whatever, that the world's wide open to them. No one cares. And it's really hard to beat this into people, right? No one really cares what you did in 8th and 9th grade or 7th or 4th or whatever. We don't really care what you did in school. Even Harvard admissions office hardly cares what you did, let alone anybody else, right? And should you ever want to go to college, and you goofed around. I mean, we have kids who get expelled from school with all Fs who are smart. I have seen kids come through our door and within a month go to community college and get an A in economics after being expelled from school with a bad record, right? It may take some gumption and some self-confidence in there, right? Or people who have really been making a mess of school and otherwise, they start becoming videographers or other clever things that they do. So there has to be, for the parent, some belief system, some understanding that if we chill, and if my kid does nothing when they're 13 or 14, and by nothing, there is no such thing as nothing, but you know what I mean by nothing. If my kid has no tangible outcomes for a while, but is safe and healthy and not complaining and not feeling bad about themselves and is enjoying their emptiness and is making some sense out of it, and they're not endangering the house or the family or the dog or anybody else around us, we can wait a while longer to see where the inspiration is going to come from. And if that's not true, I think there's a role for parents to be active. I'm not talking about hands-off, ignorant parenting, just ignore your kid and hope they turn out okay. And so there's concern. There's always concern. And I think parents can do what I'm saying much less than non-parental adults. That's why North Star exists and every kid has an advisor here.
In thinking about this phrase, that also happens to be the title of Ken's book, School is Optional, Learning is Natural, I started to understand how this statement can be generally true for all people, and that choosing school doesn't necessarily mean you'll learn, and that opting out of school doesn't necessarily mean you won't learn. The exceptions and boundaries for this phrase are a lot more subtle than the statement, what goes up must come down. So the examples won't be as contrasting as tossing your keys to a friend versus boarding an airplane or sending a satellite into space, but that the decisions you do make based on this belief that school is optional, learning is natural, it might just strengthen how you feel about the school you're already attending, or the homeschooling group you're a part of, or the unschooling environment you're choosing to explore each day. And for those that do choose school, how it might not be the school that's responsible for your learning as much as your desire, your drive, your interest in the subjects you've been offered to learn about. Or whether it's a school that you're attending because you don't believe school's optional, because it's the only path that will lead you to what you believe will eventually make you happy. And it's with this in mind that I'd like to reintroduce Alexis Burgess, who I mentioned in the previous episode. And the conversation I have with Alexis is about Alcove Self-Directed Learning Cooperative and his experience working with students in a self-directed learning environment. Alexis Burgess is the co-founder of Alcove, a self-directed learning cooperative in Los Angeles, California. He had taught philosophy at Stanford for 8 years before founding this cooperative in 2019. Our conversation touched on this idea that school is optional, learning is natural, particularly because the cooperative he founded did find inspiration in the work of Ken Danford and the North Star model, as well as from books like Creative Schools by Sir Ken Robinson. And he really gets at the whole idea behind why he believes school is optional and what it was that led him to starting Alcove in the first place.
I remember reading Creative Schools. One of the things he was advocating, if you recall, was like having a bottom-up approach to education reform. And the way the change is going to happen is just by a lot of people planting a lot of different seeds and momentum growing that way. And that reading that and hearing his arguments really persuaded me that I shouldn't try to get into education reform at the government level. I should just create a small version of the thing that I like and hope that everyone else is doing the same.
Alcove is located in downtown LA, where dozens of alternative public schools, charter schools, private schools, continuation schools, but still few non-schooling options by comparison. And as we talked about both our experience with conventional schooling, he had some kind words for educators still teaching in the larger school system.
They get it. They kind of know implicitly what would be best for the kids, but they're part of this machine. And and in many cases it's comforting because it's familiar. But it's not as though there's this whole population of professional teachers out there who are deeply skeptical about the wisdom of trying to foster a sense of autonomy in our children. It's just where, their structures, institutions are powerful, and they shape the way we live and think and everything, and they're hard to change.
Now, I wanted to tap into the belief, the value placed in this idea that school is optional. So I asked him about his thoughts on the philosophy of self-directed learning, especially given his background in education and conventional schooling and the field of philosophy.
Well, self-directed learning is a practice that we can help kids and families sort of achieve or approximate. I think there's an associated philosophy to the effect that more kids than you would think will thrive in this kind of practice. So there's the practice and there's the theory that says the practice is a good idea. I think, this reminds me, I think oftentimes when I talk to people who don't know anything about the self-directed learning movement, about it, and it understandably strikes them as radical, there's a confusion that happens. There's some sort of like quantifier confusion that happens where they think that I'm proposing that this is the way things should be for all kids. And I just have no stand on that. But what seems obvious to me is that this is the way things should be for some kids, and and it should be available. Though, of course, when you start talking about having more options available to kids, you're immediately sort of you find yourself in the deep waters of the public versus charter versus private debate wars, or whatever you want to call it. That's delicate territory, and I actually haven't thought through to the bottom of it myself to my own satisfaction. When we set up Alcove, we made a decision early on that we wanted to try to not have to take a stand on that controversy, the charter school controversy, by deciding not to serve as vendors for online charter schools, which put us at a disadvantage because some of the sort of boutique operations like ours in the LA area and further afield definitely sort of make their bread and butter that way. So we would be asking families who are already enrolled in online charters to give Alcove a try on top of that. But it felt pretty clear to me from talking to friends and philosophers and other people that the charter versus public issue was really deep and really hard. And if we could avoid it, fantastic. to answer your question again, I think self-directed learning or self-directed education is a practice. It's an activity. It's a thing you engage in. But obviously, there's an associated philosophy, and the philosophy could be put as simply as this practice, this activity, is better than certain alternatives for some people, and that's enough. I think that's obviously true, and I think that's enough motivation to get a project like Alcove up and running.
What this conversation brought to mind for me was what happens when a family does place enough value on this statement that school is optional, learning is natural, enough to begin making decisions based on this statement and strengthening it as a belief. So I asked Alexis about the kinds of experiences he's had with students from conventional schools who have come to Alcove when school just wasn't working for them.
There are kids from public school or from charter schools who aren't thriving, who are maybe getting bullied or dealing with anxiety and depression in a way that's starting to feel unmanageable and seems to be pretty context specific to the educational environment that they're in. We've got a really diverse group of kids, and a bunch of our kids are sort of stunningly smart. I used to teach college, and I interacted with a lot of really bright kids from 18 to 22. But we've got kids at Alcove right now who are intellectually competitive with the best of them at ages 12, 14. I'm constantly impressed by how powerful and raw their intelligence is at this age, especially if they've been unschooling for a while. But I think, one thing that we can do well is take kids who are super bright and are kind of bored in school because there just isn't the flexibility in the system that they're in to cater to their individual strengths and interests, and provide a course in number theory for them, or a course in cybersecurity or paleontology, whatever it is that really lights them up. We have the flexibility and agility to make that happen. And I think we do attract kids from the public/charter space in that situation specifically, where their intellect is massive and the infrastructure isn't there to serve them adequately. So I've been happy to be able to help those kids out.
As we talked about the kinds of learners that come through Alcove, one story he told highlights an early experience he had working with a teen that had come from a conventional schooling environment. Well, what happened definitely involved tapping into not just the learner's interests and motivation to learn, but also really exemplified how the parent and Alexis himself, as a mentor, built the kind of environment that's a big part of what a self-directed learning environment provides as an alternative option from the conventional schooling model.
I had a student who I'm working with who's a mentee of mine, or an advisee of mine, who I meet with weekly to talk about their academic goals and interests and artistic projects and whatnot, whatever's on their minds. And they were taking, at the time, a logic class of mine. Maybe we were 3 or 4 weeks in. And the kid, was capable of getting it, but something wasn't clicking. And, it was disappointing because I was working really hard as a teacher. Mom and I knew that he could get this stuff if he wanted to. We couldn't quite figure out what the disconnect was. But it was clear to us at that point that he just wanted to stop. And we knew there was a risk involved, because with a logic class like that, where you're working through a textbook, you can't just jump back in later and have everything be fine. If he was leaving next week, he was leaving probably for good. So, we stuck to the script and we said, listen, this is your decision. And he stopped coming. And I think it was only then, when I and his mother let him know through our actions that this was really up to him, that he believed it finally, that he realized that we were serious, that we were putting the control in his hands. And it wasn't too long after that he started lighting up and letting his personality show and reaching out to me for help about other stuff. And guess what? 2 months later, suddenly he's in logic class again. No one told him to be there. No one asked him to be there. No one nudged him in that direction. We had given up. And, we had some catch up to do behind the scenes, but he's taking the class and he's participating, which he never did before, and he's getting it. So that's a mini example, sort of a microcosm of the kind of leap of faith that we're trying to take with these kids to see what happens. And even if he hadn't come back to logic class, that would have been totally fine too. Already in those early weeks, there was a payoff that we could tangibly see in the way that he was engaging with me and with mom around taking control of his own education, because he saw the proof in the pudding that we were serious about the philosophy. We weren't just talking the talk, we were letting him and us walk the walk.
After speaking with Ken and Alexis, I can't help but wonder what other options for self-directed learning are available. And perhaps more importantly, can what these other options are offering be incorporated into the more conventional schooling environment? Well, in the next episode, I speak to a few traditional school educators who became leaders of their own self-directed learning environments. And I dig into what makes their environment so unique, especially given that they're focused on primary or elementary age learners. Tune into the next episode for those conversations. But you can learn more about Ken Danford and North Star through their website, northstarteens.org. Alexis Burgess at Alcove can also be reached through their own website at alcovelearning.org. Now, as I bring this second episode to a close, I want to bring back a visual from this second season's introductory episode, where I talk about capturing a rainbow. As I continue exploring the core of who we are and how we learn, keep in mind that all of the topics and all of the people throughout this season are all part of the environment responsible for creating that rainbow, but are not the rainbow itself. So the question to ask is not how this episode provides you the complete picture, but how the ideas presented connect with the ideas in the other episodes, so you can come to a conclusion that's meaningful for you and your community. I hope you're enjoying the second season, and I thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.